Inside Parchman Prison, how extreme isolation redefined punishment in America. There's a moment inside Parchman Prison when time stops behaving normally. Minutes stretch into hours. Hours dissolve into something shapeless. Men begin to measure days not by light or darkness, but by sounds, a distant door, a tray sliding through steel, footsteps that never stop long enough to mean company. What breaks people here is not violence. It's absence. Absence of touch. Absence of voice. Absence of proof that the outside world still remembers your name. This is not a story about punishment gone wrong. This is a story about what happens to the human mind when isolation becomes policy. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Parchman Prison was built to enforce order. Over time, it became something far more complex, a system where control, isolation, and psychological endurance quietly replaced traditional punishment. Across American corrections, extreme isolation was justified as necessary to manage risk, reduce violence, and maintain safety. But decades of psychological research now point to a harder truth. The human brain does not adapt to isolation the way institutions expect it to. This documentary does not rely on rumors or shock narratives. It follows documented psychological findings, correctional records, and real behavioral patterns observed repeatedly inside high-isolation housing. What emerges is a pattern that raises one unsettling question. At what point does confinement stop correcting behavior and start reshaping the mind itself? When isolation becomes the environment. Inside restrictive housing at Parchman, the environment is deliberately simplified. The cell is small. The routine is rigid. Human contact is reduced to brief, functional exchanges. At first, most inmates respond predictably. They pace. They count. They attempt to maintain routines, push-ups, mental schedules, silent conversations with themselves. This phase is often mistaken for resilience. Psychologists describe this as cognitive anchoring, the brain clinging to structure to preserve a sense of control. But research from the National Institute of Justice and long-term confinement studies shows that the brain does not remain stable in this state. After weeks or months, behavior begins to shift. Sleep fragments. Thoughts loop without resolution. Minor sounds become magnified, sometimes threatening. Correctional reports describe inmates speaking less, not out of compliance, but because language itself begins to feel unnecessary. The brain, deprived of feedback, starts conserving energy by reducing communication. One former inmate described it later, not emotionally, but clinically. It wasn't loneliness. It was like my mind stopped expecting people to exist. Psychologists call this social deactivation, a survival response where the brain minimizes social processing to cope with prolonged absence. It is not madness. It is adaptation. But adaptation comes at a cost. As isolation continues, emotional regulation weakens. Anger and numbness replace nuance. Memory recall becomes unreliable. Some inmates begin reacting strongly to neutral events, a door opening, a light flickering. Not because they're violent, but because the brain has recalibrated its threat system. Importantly, these patterns appear even in individuals with no prior history of severe mental illness. This is the point where isolation stops being a condition and becomes the environment the mind is forced to live inside. And once the brain adjusts to that environment, returning to normal human interaction is no longer automatic. It must be relearned. The brain under quiet pressure. Long-term isolation does not attack the mind loudly. It works slowly through silence. Psychological studies reviewed by the American Psychological Association describe this process as sensory narrowing, when the brain, deprived of stimulation, begins to reduce how it processes reality, not as a breakdown, but as an energy-saving response. Inside Parchman's restrictive housing, this narrowing follows a pattern. First, attention collapses inward. Inmates report replaying the same memories repeatedly, not because they are meaningful, but because the brain has run out of new input. Thought becomes circular. Time becomes subjective. Researchers Craig Haney and John Irwin documented this phenomenon across multiple high-isolation facilities. The mind turns itself into its only environment. As weeks turn into months, emotional signals begin to flatten. Fear, joy, anticipation, all blur into a muted baseline. This is not calm. It is emotional compression. Correctional staff often misinterpret this stage as stability. Behavioral incidents may decrease. Silence increases. Compliance improves. But psychologists warn that this phase represents psychological withdrawal, not recovery. Former inmates from Mississippi facilities later described losing the ability to gauge emotional intensity. One man explained that when he was finally spoken to at length, his body reacted before his mind did. Heart racing, hands shaking, not from anger, but from overload. The brain, adapted to near-total quiet, had lost its tolerance for human unpredictability. This reaction aligns with findings from the National Institute of Justice. Prolonged isolation lowers the threshold for stress response, making ordinary interaction neurologically overwhelming. In this state, even neutral authority, a question, an instruction, can feel intrusive. Some inmates begin avoiding eye contact. Others stop responding verbally altogether. Importantly, this is not defiance. It is neurological self-protection. The Chicago Crime Lab's analysis of post-isolation behavior shows a consistent outcome. Individuals released directly from extreme isolation into general population or society experience elevated anxiety, impaired decision-making, and delayed emotional processing. The brain has learned a rule that no longer applies. Silence equals safety. Interaction equals risk. And once that rule is internalized, it does not disappear when the cell door opens. It follows the individual into shared spaces, into conversations, into freedom itself. This is the paradox of isolation. The system removes social contact to maintain order, then releases individuals whose brains have been trained to fear it. And the consequences of that training do not stay behind prison walls. When identity starts to thin, after prolonged isolation, the damage is no longer just emotional or cognitive. It becomes existential. Researchers from the APA and long-term confinement studies describe a stage where individuals begin experiencing identity thinning, a gradual weakening of the sense of self that normally forms through interaction, feedback, and social recognition. Inside isolation, no one mirrors you back to yourself. There are no casual conversations, no arguments that resolve, no shared moments that confirm continuity. The brain, designed to define identity through relationship, is forced to operate without reference points. At Parchman, correctional records and post-release evaluations show that some inmates begin speaking about themselves in the third person. Others describe feeling unfinished, as if parts of their personality were suspended rather than gone. This is not dissociation in the dramatic sense. It is identity erosion. Craig Haney's analysis explains why this happens. When social feedback disappears, the brain reduces self-monitoring functions. You stop asking, how am I being perceived? Because perception no longer exists. One formerly isolated inmate later explained it this way. I didn't feel broken. I felt incomplete, like I was paused. Psychologically, this matters. Identity thinning weakens impulse control, not because a person becomes reckless, but because future-oriented thinking requires a stable sense of self. Planning, restraint, and moral reasoning all depend on believing you exist beyond the present moment. Without that belief, decisions shrink to survival logic. Correctional officers interviewed in institutional reviews noticed a pattern. Inmates nearing release from restrictive housing often appeared calm, detached, even cooperative, yet struggled the most after transition. The Chicago Crime Lab identified this as delayed destabilization, problems emerging not during isolation, but after exposure to normal social complexity. Noise becomes overwhelming. Choice becomes stressful. Ambiguity becomes threatening. The mind, trained in an environment where nothing changes, now has to navigate a world where everything does. This is where isolation reveals its final contradiction. It creates control by removing unpredictability, then releases individuals into a society built entirely on it. And once identity has thinned, rebuilding it is not automatic. It requires time, support, and human contact, the very element isolation was designed to remove. The people who never left the cell. Isolation does not end at the cell door. It radiates outward. While inmates experience confinement directly, families experience it through absence without closure, a psychological state studied extensively in correctional family impact research. At Parchman, communication from restrictive housing is limited, irregular, and often impersonal. Letters arrive late or not at all. Phone calls, when permitted, are brief and tightly controlled. Family members describe learning to speak in fragments, avoiding emotion, avoiding questions, because anything complex risks being cut short. Psychologists refer to this as relational compression. Relationships forced in simplified forms to survive restriction. Parents begin to mark time differently. Children grow used to one-sided conversations. Partners carry daily decisions alone, without shared accountability. The National Institute of Justice notes that this prolonged separation produces chronic anticipatory stress. Families remain emotionally alert for years, unsure when contact will resume or whether their loved one is psychologically stable. Correctional staff are not immune. Officers assigned to high isolation units report elevated emotional fatigue, even when incident rates are low. The work is quiet but constant. Monitoring silence requires vigilance. Responding to minimal interaction demands emotional suppression. Institutional reviews linked to APA findings show that prolonged exposure to isolation environments can lead to empathic blunting among staff, not cruelty, but a defensive reduction of emotional engagement. One former officer described it without bitterness. You stop reacting because reacting makes it heavier. This mutual withdrawal, inmates withdrawing inward, families holding back, staff emotionally narrowing, creates a system where detachment becomes functional. But detachment is not neutral. When isolation becomes normalized, the human cost becomes harder to see, not because it disappears, but because everyone involved has learned not to look directly at it. This is how extreme systems sustain themselves, not through constant force, but through shared emotional distance. And that distance leaves marks long after release, transfer, or retirement. Release without reentry / the door opening is not the end of isolation. For many, it is where the consequences finally surface. Research from the Chicago Crime Lab and the National Institute of Justice shows that individuals released directly from high isolation housing face disproportionate adjustment difficulty, even compared to those released from general population. The reason is neurological. During isolation, the brain learns stability through sameness. Upon release, it encounters noise, choice, proximity, and unpredictability all at once. Former inmates describe ordinary environments as hostile. Grocery stores feel chaotic. Conversations require constant interpretation. Eye contact becomes exhausting. This is not resistance to society. It is sensory overload. Craig Haney's post-confinement evaluations found that many individuals respond by narrowing their world again, avoiding people, avoiding public spaces, avoiding complexity. The isolation continues, now self-imposed. Paradoxically, This behavior is often misunderstood as noncompliance or lack of motivation. But psychologically, it is pattern persistence. The brain continues using the rule it learned under confinement. Less interaction equals safety. Without structured reentry support, this rule can dominate behavior for years. Some individuals cycle back into the system not because of violence, but because they struggle with decision-making under pressure, missed appointments, misunderstandings, reactive behavior, and stressful encounters. The system interprets these as failures of character. The research suggests otherwise. They are failures of transition. Isolation reshapes the brain in ways that demand gradual resocialization, not sudden exposure. When that step is skipped, the cost appears later, in recidivism, mental health crises, and fractured families. The quiet damage of isolation does not announce itself at release. It unfolds slowly in daily life, long after the cell has been left behind. The question is not control. By the time isolation reaches its longest durations, the debate is no longer about discipline. It becomes a question of outcomes. Decades of research from the APA, NIJ, and correctional evaluations converge on a consistent finding. Prolonged isolation does not reliably produce long-term behavioral improvement. It produces adaptation to absence. Inside Parchman, as in many American facilities, isolation emerged as a solution to manage immediate risk. And in the short term, it can reduce visible incidents. But psychologically, it creates a delayed cost. The brain learns to survive by narrowing, withdrawing, conserving. These are effective strategies inside a cell and destabilizing ones outside it. Correctional policy reviews show that facilities implementing graduated step-down programs experience fewer post-release incidents, not because inmates are treated leniently, but because the brain is allowed to recalibrate gradually. This aligns with Irwin's institutional research. Behavior improves not when control increases, but when predictable human contact is restored in measured ways. The question, then, is not whether isolation works in the moment. The question is what it produces afterward. A system can be quiet and still be damaging. Order can exist alongside long-term instability. When isolation becomes the default response, it solves an immediate problem by exporting its consequences into the future, into communities, families, and public systems unprepared to absorb them. This is not an argument built on emotion. It is a pattern built on evidence. And once patterns are visible, they invite responsibility, not just from institutions, but from a society that authorizes them. What happens after silence? Isolation teaches the brain a lesson it never needed to learn. That survival requires disappearance. Undoing that lesson takes time, contact, and intention, the very elements most restricted environments remove. Parchman is not an exception. It is a case study, a place where policy, psychology, and human biology intersect, quietly, consistently, and with lasting effect. If we want safer systems, safer communities, and real rehabilitation, the evidence suggests one thing clearly. Silence cannot be the only answer. If this documentary helped you understand incarceration beyond headlines, subscribe to Life of Prisoners. We publish research-based documentaries examining the psychological realities behind prison walls, without sensationalism, without repetition, and without easy answers. Your attention keeps these stories grounded in evidence, not noise.